From shattered kingdoms and granite hills, two brothers forged an empire that dominated the peninsula for 2 centuries. The Sangama dynasty chose the Tungabhadra's rocky embrace. Building more than a capital, they built defiance. Krishnadevaraya transformed defiance into dominance, his armies reclaiming territories while poets filled his courts. Yet brilliance invited envy. When Rama Raya manipulated Deccan politics too boldly, 5 sultanates united. At Talikota, Vijayanagara's armies shattered. Hampi burned. The empire that seemed eternal dissolved into regional kingdoms, leaving only ruins glowing amber at sunset, monuments to glory that rose from chaos and returned to dust. Storms never arrive without warning. Long before thunder rolls across the horizon, the air thickens, the ground tenses, and people sense that something old is about to end. That is how the early 14th century felt across South India. Kings who had once ruled with certainty now watched their banners torn down one by one, and the great houses of the south, Hoysala, Kakatiya, Pandya, began to collapse under the same pressure. A force sweeping downward from the north with a speed no one had expected. Armies carrying foreign standards crossed the borders in quick, punishing raids. Forts burned before riders even saw them coming. Temple cities that had survived centuries of conflict felt the ground tremble as new enemies approached with unfamiliar tactics and the clear intent to dismantle everything in their path. Each season delivered fresh waves of destruction. Caravans vanished along roads that had once been safe. Grain fields near the Tungabhadra stood abandoned as villagers fled to hilltops, unsure whether they would ever reclaim their farms. Even the strongest among the southern kingdoms faltered. The Hoysalas, who controlled the heart of Karnataka, were trapped between defending their borders and managing internal fractures. The Kakatiyas, guardians of the eastern plateau, were overwhelmed in a campaign that ended their lineage entirely. After their fall, the remaining powers realized how thin the line had become between survival and erasure. Fragmented chiefs retreated into forests, gathering anyone still willing to resist. But no one had the unity or the vision to forge a response capable of matching the scale of the threat. Amid this disorder, 2 brothers moved quietly through the shifting landscape. Harihara and Buka had served as commanders under the old Hoysala order, but service to a fading crown offered little protection in a world suddenly rewritten by war. They witnessed firsthand how fast a kingdom could be reduced to ash, how one failed harvest, one broken alliance, or one raid too many could erase generations of authority. Where others saw only ruins, the brothers recognized an opportunity that demanded boldness. They understood that the South didn't need another small chief trying to survive alone. It needed an anchor, something rooted deep enough to withstand the storms rising from beyond the Deccan. They began in the one place the northern armies had not yet managed to seize, the rugged interior around the Tungabhadra. Hills of split granite formed a natural barricade. Narrow passes offered defense where stone took the place of walls, and the open plains between the boulders could feed both families and soldiers if organized with care. Small bands of displaced warriors, forest guides, herding clans, and temple dependents drifted into the brothers' orbit. Some joined for protection, others for revenge, and a few because they sensed that these 2 commanders carried a steadiness missing in every other claimant. What took shape was not yet a kingdom. It was a shelter held together by trust more than titles. The brothers forged alliances. The traditional powers had long ignored chiefs from the Ghats, leaders of hill communities, remnants of old Hoysala units, and families guarding sacred sites. all found themselves part of something larger than their own lands. The bond worked because the brothers spoke not of restoring the world that had been lost, but of building one strong enough to survive the world that was coming. In the early stages, their power held by the thinnest thread. Yet as 1 year bled into the next, something remarkable happened. Devastation in the surrounding regions pushed more people toward the Tungabhadra traders, whose routes had collapsed, sought security along the brothers' roads. Farmers who had abandoned their fields found cleared ground waiting for them. Even wandering scholars and priests, carrying stories of ruined sanctuaries, paused long enough to see that this gathering might actually endure. Word spread that the hills sheltered commanders who could hold a defensive line longer than anyone else. Whether that was entirely true didn't matter. What mattered was that people believed it. The location itself became part of the rising momentum. Across the river, a cluster of shrines sat on centuries-old stone, surrounded by ridges that formed a natural fortress without a single wall. Paths carved by ancient hands still threaded between rocks the color of rusted iron. At dusk, those stones glowed as if lit from within, an effect that travelers interpreted as resilience rather than ruin. The place had no grand name then. It was simply a rugged settlement, with wells, shrines, and a landscape that refused to yield. But for the brothers, it was perfect. They chose this terrain with deliberate intent. Here, enemies would be slowed long before reaching the inner plains. Here, a capital could rise, without being exposed to the chaos that had swept the rest of the south. Here, an idea could take root. An idea that the South did not need to wait for rescue from fading dynasties or distant claimants. It could shape its own future. The brothers began to organize what they had gathered. Defensible ridgelines were mapped and reinforced. New paths replaced those shattered in earlier raids. Agreements were struck with nearby households willing to supply grain, cattle, or specialist labor. Temples that had survived the turmoil were restored not as symbols of nostalgia, but as anchors to unify families who spoke different languages and followed different customs. Every action strengthened the center that had begun to form around the brothers, turning the once scattered survivors into a coherent force. As the months passed, the brothers found themselves leading more than a refuge. They were leading a region that had not only stabilized, it had begun to grow old Hoysala nobles who had fled northward after their defeat, now looked south again and saw a rare patch of stability. Some brought caravans filled with tools, manuscripts, and family treasures they had managed to protect during the collapses. Others brought retainers who knew how to survey land or build irrigation works. Each arrival added weight to the brothers' foundation. What started as a stronghold was turning into a nucleus, a place around which something larger could be shaped. The people following the brothers began using a new word to describe the growing settlement: headquarters, center, origin. They meant different things, but the sentiment was the same. The South, fractured and exhausted, had finally produced a force capable of answering the storms gathering over its borders. The brothers understood it too. If they stopped now, everything would crumble the moment a greater army descended. To secure the land, they needed a true capital, one built not simply to survive, but to command one that could project confidence across hills, river crossings, fertile plains, and coastal routes. One that could declare to every shattered house of the South that their future did not end in fire. In choosing to build that capital, the brothers set a course that would transform the fate of the entire peninsula. But before palaces rose and avenues formed, before their banners flew over distant coasts, one truth had already emerged among those who followed them. The storms that had torn apart the old kingdoms had also cleared the ground for something greater. And in the shadow of the Tungabhadra's granite hills, that something had begun to rise. Dawn arrived differently in the Tungabhadra valley, once the brothers committed to shaping a capital. The first light touched the boulders like a signal, revealing workers already in motion. Masons hauling stone along narrow ridgelines, carpenters marking beams laid out on packed earth, and surveyors aligning paths that would soon become streets. What had begun as a refuge was taking on the outline of a city, not in scattered pockets, but as an intentional, rising whole. The terrain dictated the first decisions. Granite hills formed the skeleton, so the brothers built around them instead of against them. Passes became gateways. Ridges became natural barricades. The river, roaring in some seasons and whispering in others, offered both protection and life. Wells were deepened, old canals were cleared, and new channels were planned to capture every drop the hills could offer. As water flowed in wider, steadier lines, settlement patterns expanded with it. Farmers dug new plots in soil that had been abandoned for years, and merchants set up stalls near the paths that fed toward the heart of the growing city. Construction moved outward like a pulse. The earliest structures grew close to ancient shrines, already rooted in the stone, sanctuaries that had survived the collapses of earlier kings. Their presence gave the settlement a sense of continuity, something firm enough to unify Kannada, Telugu, and Tamil communities arriving from different corners of the south. Rebuilding them became one of the brothers' early strategic acts. Temples, once cracked by neglect or scorched by earlier raids, rose again with fresh stone and new artistry. Their restoration was not about ritual alone. It was about weaving the region together at a moment when unity mattered more than lineage or dialect. Beyond the shrines, the first wide avenue took shape. It did not appear overnight. It emerged as masons carved parallel tracks through the rock, setting markers where Gopuram foundations would eventually stand. Stalls lined the path even before the buildings did. Healers offering herbs, potters displaying rough clay vessels, cattle traders leading animals from one district to another. The avenue signaled intention. Anyone entering the hills understood immediately that they were not stumbling into a temporary camp. They were stepping into the early form of a capital. As the city expanded, the brothers refined the system that would sustain it. They reorganized landholdings, adapting old Hoysala practices to new realities. Villages attached to Hampi paid dues in grain, cattle, and labor, supporting the defensive works rising across the ridges. Taxation was calibrated to survival, not excess, an approach that convinced many displaced nobles to bind their families to the new order rather than attempt to rebuild old claims. With each agreement, the city's influence widened, linking valley, plateau, and forest in a network more resilient than anything the region had seen since the fall of the major dynasties. Yet constructing walls and temples was only part of what held the momentum together. The brothers needed commanders who could enforce stability across a region still haunted by the memory of collapse. They began appointing trusted fighters as local stewards, forming the early shape of the Nayaka system. These men oversaw fortifications, gathered levies when necessary, and kept the roads secure. Their authority was tied directly to loyalty, not inherited privilege, and their success depended on how well they protected the communities under their watch. It was a practical solution for a landscape in flux, and it strengthened the brothers' rule faster than the building of any single fortress. The city itself took on layers. Markets settled near the riverbanks, where boats ferried goods from distant settlements. Workshops formed clusters near the granite quarries, their workers shaping beams and carving stone panels for new structures. Residential quarters expanded along the slopes, and soon families from every direction came seeking stability. Artisans from the coast, cattle herders from the uplands, and traders who had once passed through hurriedly but now saw reason to remain. The shift was undeniable. Hampi was no longer a place people ran to in desperation. It was a place they came to invest in, to claim, to defend. With growth came attention. Regional powers, some weakened, some ambitious, watched the Sangama expansion closely. The Madurai Sultanate eyed the developments warily, sensing a rising force in the interior that could threaten its fragile control of the far south. The Bahmani sultans to the north interpreted the brothers' consolidation as a challenge to their influence in the Deccan. Smaller coastal polities, dependent on trade flowing through inland passes, recognized that the new center could dictate terms in the years ahead. Pressure built from every direction, but the brothers pressed on. The more the world shifted around them, the faster their city took shape. As the first watchtowers rose above the ridges, a transformation occurred in the hearts of the people living there. The hills, once a symbol of retreat, had become symbols of permanence. The brothers declared that the settlement would not remain merely a stronghold. It would become the seat of a new power, one capable of defending the south, stabilizing its fractured lands, and anchoring its future. The declaration did not come with ceremony. It emerged through action, the building of roads, the restoration of temples, the training of soldiers, the alliances formed across language and caste lines. But when the moment finally arrived, when the brothers stood before the leaders who had gathered under their protection, the intent crystallized into a single step forward. They had chosen a capital worthy of an empire. Now they chose the empire itself. Harihara assumed rulership, marking the beginning of a new southern dynasty. Bukka stood beside him, shaping the structures that would support the throne. Together, they laid down the first lines of governance from the heart of their rising city. The world outside the Tungabhadra Valley may not have grasped the significance immediately, but those who lived there felt the change as surely as they felt the heat rising from the granite at noon. A homeland battered by raids had found its shield. A region fractured by loss had found its center, and between the river and the hills, among the stones that had guarded the land for centuries, the foundations of Vijayanagara settled into place. What followed was not guaranteed triumph, only the promise of it. Yet for the south, that promise was enough. The city would grow, its power would spread, and the empire the brothers had envisioned in the ashes of fallen kingdoms would begin its long ascent toward dominance. Strength brings choices, and Bukka Raya faced them as soon as the city he and his brother had carved from stone began to breathe like a capital Hampi. No longer felt like a refuge resisting the darkness. It pulsed with the confidence of a rising state. Craftsmen arrived without being summoned. Caravans lingered longer than planned. Chiefs who once scorned alliances now came seeking them. With the foundations secure, the question was no longer whether Vijayanagara could endure. It was what shape its destiny would take once it turned outward. The first direction that called to Bukka lay in the deep south. Tamil country, once vibrant with Chola temples, flood-fed farmlands, and merchant fleets, had been gradually weakened under the Madurai Sultanate years of uncertain rule, had drained its resilience. Trade routes faltered, sacred centers dimmed, coastal towns lost the rhythm that had once tied them to Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and distant Southeast Asian ports. Even inland, some villages stood half abandoned, still bearing the marks of an era when survival had replaced ambition. To Buka, this landscape was not simply a region in distress. It was the key to shaping an empire that spanned the southern peninsula. Whoever controlled these lands controlled the deltas, the ports, the agrarian wealth, and the old arteries of culture. Moving south was not about expanding territory for prestige. It was about restoring a heartland whose stability could support an empire for generations. His advance was deliberate. Columns of infantry and cavalry followed river valleys that had served as natural corridors for centuries. They camped near wells rather than seize them, guarded markets rather than plunder them, and sent word ahead to chiefs willing to talk rather than resist. Villagers who had grown accustomed to unpredictable raids watched from behind doorways and mangrove shadows, prepared for flight. But when they saw granaries left untouched and shrines approached with quiet respect, their fear shifted into cautious trust. Many communities approached the camps themselves, seeking protection or guidance. Others tested the army's intentions with small requests: disputes to settle, bandits to drive away, fields to reclaim. Before the next planting season, Buka's forces responded with a steadiness rarely seen in turbulent times, and with each gesture, the south leaned closer. Resistance came from strongholds still loyal to Madurai, fortified by habit rather than conviction. These positions tried to hold the line, but they lacked the network needed to survive the tightening ring around them. When communication faltered and supply paths were severed, their commanders realized that isolation had condemned them long before Vijayanagara's troops arrived at their gates. Those who surrendered early found places within the new order. Those who held out discovered that their defeat did not bring devastation. It brought integration. Once the sultanate's influence weakened, restoration began in earnest. Temple cities long overshadowed by uncertainty awakened to the sound of chisels and the murmur of daytime activity. Stone corridors, once silent, filled again with movement. Courtyard trees were pruned back, water tanks dredged, and cracked shrines patched with fresh granite. Restoring these spaces meant restoring communal life, which the people embraced with an eagerness that surprised even Vijayanagara's commanders. The revival created a psychological shift. The South was not merely conquered, it was rebuilt, renewed, and woven deliberately into a wider vision. While the South pulled itself together, the northern frontier simmered. The Bahmane Sultanate, observing the Sangama expansion, sharpened its attention. Between these two rising powers stretched the Raichur Doab, a region that seemed modest at first glance. Fields fed by 2 rivers, a few forts, and stretches of gently rolling land. Yet its strategic value made it one of the most contested zones in the subcontinent. Whoever controlled the Doab controlled movement across the Deccan. The routes of cavalry, the timing of campaigns, the patterns of trade. Losing it meant a fractured frontier. Gaining it meant leverage. Clashes began as small tests. Skirmishes erupted near riverbanks where patrols stumbled upon one another in the blue hours before dawn. Scouts reported rival encampments appearing and vanishing in a matter of days. Forts flew alternating banners as each side attempted to assert pressure without committing to full war. Farmers along the frontier learned to recognize the distant rumble of hooves as the herald of yet another temporary shift in control. These encounters rarely lasted long, but each one deepened the rivalry. Each one prepared the ground for a conflict neither side could avoid forever. Even with tension building in the north, Buka kept his focus on consolidation. Victory meant little without the structures to sustain it. He forged alliances with Tamil and Telugu households whose influence stretched across river deltas, forested passes, and island-like pockets of fertile land. Marriage alliances solidified these connections, binding families together through shared lineage and obligation. These dignitaries brought with them retainers, administrators, scribes, and military contingents who strengthened Vijayanagara's reach. As the court diversified, Hampi's avenues echoed with a blend of languages, customs, and old family traditions that merged into a new political identity. Meanwhile, the land itself demanded restoration. Years of unsupervised conflict had damaged irrigation systems that once fed entire districts. Canals thickened with silt, embankments cracked under the weight of storms, and reservoirs lay dormant at the foot of hills that desperately needed their water. Buka understood that rebuilding these structures was not simply a matter of agricultural reform. It was a declaration of permanence. Field by field, tank by tank, the landscape changed. Workers cleared channels with iron tools handed down through generations. Mason teams reinforced walls with stone cut from quarries near the capital. And slowly, the reservoirs filled again. When water returned, villages returned. Rice fields spread. Sugarcane reappeared. Land that had felt abandoned began producing more than before the collapse. These revived regions strengthened the empire's logistical backbone. Grain could now be stored and transported north. Herds grew large enough to support expanding cavalry units. The empire's planners noted how districts that had once begged for protection were now capable of supplying soldiers, tools, and taxes. Stability, carefully planted, was yielding its first harvests. The capital reflected this transformation. Hampi, which only a generation earlier had been little more than a fortified settlement, clinging to river and rock, now felt like a city with gravity caravans from the south, arrived with indigo, pepper, woven cloth, coconut oil, and carved images destined for northern shrines. The markets expanded to accommodate this traffic, their noise stretching farther across the streets each month. Soldiers stationed in outposts traveled through the capital on rotation, adding movement and energy to the central avenues. In the workshops, smiths shaped weapons for the guards holding the Doab frontier, while artisans carved panels for temples rising in restored southern towns. With the empire's borders extending farther each season, Buka and his advisors sensed a crucial truth. Vijayanagara was no longer an upstart kingdom proving its right to exist. It was becoming an inevitable power, reshaping the Deccan through a mixture of restoration, diplomacy, and strategic pressure. But expansion always casts new shadows. The Bahmani Sultanate, unsettled by Vijayanagara's swift southern victories, strengthened its cavalry forces and fortified key positions along the frontier. Both sides adjusted their military systems. Vijayanagara, with its growing use of foot soldiers supported by fortified supply lines. The Bahmanis, with their heavy cavalry and rapidly expanding stock of imported war horses. The rivalry that had once manifested in sporadic skirmishes was beginning to coalesce into something larger. Even so, the South remained Buka's greatest achievement. Under his direction, the lost Chola heartlands stabilized. Harbor towns prepared for renewed maritime traffic. Inland markets revived. Roads clogged by years of neglect were cleared for steady movement. The region's recovery was not merely administrative. It was felt in the everyday rhythms of life. In the return of boats to delta canals, the sound of temple drums marking festivals that had been silent for years, and the steady growth of villages that stretched outward like newly watered vines. By the time Buka completed his southern consolidation, Vijayanagara's reach extended across a landscape that was beginning to believe in itself again. What had once been fractured was now bound to a capital rising with every passing season. The Sangama vision, crafted amid fire, ruin, and uncertainty, was no longer a promise. It was becoming the architecture of a new southern order. And though the northern frontier glimmered with tension that would eventually erupt into larger conflict, the empire stood secure, confident, and prepared for the challenges to come. Prosperity arrived in layers, each one settling quietly over Vijayanagara, until the city seemed to radiate a confidence that travelers could sense long before they stepped inside its walls. By the time Bukharaya's campaigns transformed the south and stabilized the Deccan frontier, the capital had evolved into something far greater than a military stronghold. Its avenues filled with a rhythm that reached far beyond the clang of workshops or the march of soldiers. It was the rhythm of an emerging cultural world, one shaped by poets, artisans, scholars, dancers, merchants, commanders, and the thousands who wove new traditions into the empire's expanding framework. With territory secured and revenue flowing, the court placed deliberate emphasis on patronage. Poets from Karnataka, Andhra, and Tamil regions arrived carrying manuscripts, seeking patrons who could help refine their work. Some came to test their skills in a court known for appreciating subtlety and layered expression. Others arrived because they sensed a rare opportunity, a dynasty not only strong enough to commission art, but stable enough to preserve it. The court welcomed them freely. Language, after all, posed no barrier. Kannada verses mingled with Telugu epics. Sanskrit scholars joined debates that lasted deep into the evening, while temple poets adapted old stories to the needs of a new empire. What took shape was not simply a collection of works. It was a shared identity built through artistic exchange. The capital became a place where regional traditions interacted without losing themselves. A Kannada poet could stand alongside a Telugu storyteller without competing for dominance. The empire's reach encouraged this balance. As long as the kingdom remained strong, every region under its banner carried value, and every language received its moment on the stage. This cultural energy spilled into architecture. Temple builders, inspired by older traditions, yet encouraged to innovate, experimented on a scale unseen in generations. Multi-tiered towers, gopurams, rose above the city, each one adorned with stone and plaster figures shaped by artisans who understood both myth and mathematics. Pillared halls expanded in complexity, ceilings carved with symmetrical patterns, corridors lined with sculptures that captured dancers mid-motion, gods mid-step, and mythical beasts frozen in eternal watch. Even the city's secular buildings reflected a new blend of ideals. Some embraced pure southern forms, others borrowed motifs from beyond the guards. Arched windows, domed chambers, geometric facades suggested influences that had traveled across the plateau and found new expression in the empire's capital. Markets thrived alongside this cultural shift. The city's layout made trade predictable, and predictability brought merchants from regions that had once been hesitant to journey inland. Horse traders from the plateau arrived with animals specially trained for battlefield maneuvering. Pearl merchants traveled inland from coastal towns carrying shells, pearls, coral, and ornaments. Craft guilds in the interior, textile weavers, metal workers, stone carvers, coordinated their production to meet the growing demands of urban consumers. The arrival of imported horses marked a turning point in the empire's military and economic system. The elite cavalry, long overshadowed by the infantry in earlier southern polities, now found its place at the core of Vijayanagara's strategic planning. Maintaining these horses required specialized care, stables, trainers, and a steady flow of fodder from the fertile plains. As a result, entire districts were reorganized to support cavalry units. Farmers near major trade routes cultivated additional fodder crops. Blacksmiths adapted new saddle and stirrup designs. Artisans began producing ornate bridles, badges, and armor for ceremonial processions. The horse trade thus became more than a military matter. It became part of the empire's identity. Even inland markets benefited. Caravans brought textiles dyed in deep indigo or vibrant reds, woven in patterns that shifted with regional preferences. Ivory workers from the south shaped bangles, combs, and ritual objects that found their way into distant courts. Stonecutters carved portable images of deities for merchants' households, while metal workers produced tools and weapon fittings essential to the empire's growth. The city filled with the scent of drying herbs, ground pigments, lamp oil, and spices carried from the deltas. Sounds from workshops echoed through the commercial quarters, chisels tapping, wheels spinning, metal cooling in small forges. As Vijayanagara flourished, the Nayaka system took on a shape that would define the empire's political life for generations. These local commanders, initially appointed as practical overseers, slowly became pillars of administration. Their authority extended over forts, markets, rural districts, and even temple towns. They served as intermediaries between the capital and the regions, ensuring taxes were collected, roads maintained, and disputes settled before they escalated. Yet their rise carried a dual nature. Their loyalty strengthened the empire's backbone, but their increasing autonomy planted the first subtle signs of decentralization. For now, however, the system worked. These men fought for the empire, built for it, and enforced order in places where central oversight could not always reach. Cultural life continued to expand. Music found new patrons. Dancers trained in temple traditions performed before nobles who recognized the power of art to unify and display imperial sophistication. Performance spaces, temporary or permanent, sprang up around major festivals. Processions grew larger each year, reflecting both devotion and political messaging. Colorful banners flapped in the wind. Drummers set the pulse that guided crowds through the streets. In these moments, the empire presented itself not only as a political authority, but as a cultural center worthy of admiration. Writers and philosophers took notice. The empire's practices became a subject of study. Its moral order, its approach to rulership, its restoration of temples, its management of diverse regions. While no single treatise defined the era, a general mood emerged across different courts and monasteries. Vijayanagara had revitalized something ancient, not by copying the past, but by using it as a foundation for something new. All of this coexisted with the persistent tension along the northern frontier. The Bahmani Sultanate remained alert. Envoys watched Vijayanagara's movements through intermediaries. Scouts noted the increasing number of fortifications rising near the river crossings. Border markets, shared by both empires through complex arrangements, had become places where diplomacy, trade, and suspicion merged. One day brought peaceful exchange. The next day delivered a skirmish between rival patrols. Even in peace, the air carried the expectation of conflict. Yet this looming rivalry did not stifle growth. If anything, it sharpened Vijayanagara's resolve to cultivate resources, talent, and unity before a larger clash arrived. The court invested in new administrative practices. Land surveys were repeated to ensure accurate leveling of taxes. Villages that had recovered from earlier devastation saw their obligations recalibrated to reflect new output. Skilled workers received stipends during major projects to prevent migration during lean seasons. Merchant guilds were given privileges that secured their loyalty and kept their operations predictable. These decisions had a profound effect. Predictability became a hallmark of Vijayanagara's rule. Even families who had once drifted between allegiances or maintained a cautious neutrality now acknowledged that this empire offered stability unlike any other in the Deccan. Such stability encouraged noble families from distant provinces to send their sons to serve in the capital. They entered as scribes, guards, junior commanders, or scholars attached to temples or administrative offices over time. This influx created a new generation whose loyalty lay not with old regional identities, but with the empire that had shaped their adulthood. Their presence reinforced Vijayanagara's cohesion and expanded its intellectual depth. Meanwhile, artisans in the capital continued to innovate. Workshops dedicated to stonework experimented with increasingly intricate column structures. Sculptors captured movement in stone that seemed impossible. Dancers poised mid-spin, horses caught in the moment before charging, warriors readying their bows. Metalworkers crafted both ceremonial and functional pieces, from ornate lamps hung in temple halls to weapon fittings used in frontier garrisons. Each new creation echoed the empire's confidence. Even outside the capital, towns across the south began to mirror Vijayanagara's momentum. Newly restored temples attracted pilgrims who spent coin in nearby markets. Ports resumed regular activity, sending out cargo that now bore the influence of imperial order. Inland fairs expanded, drawing merchants who had once avoided travel beyond their own districts. The empire's cultural reach traveled farther than its armies, shaping regions through shared aesthetics and administrative patterns. But beneath this growing tapestry of prosperity, the rivalry with the Bahmani Sultanate remained the quiet engine driving many of Vijayanagara's decisions. Every fortification near the frontier was built with future conflict in mind. Every improved canal or expanded market contributed to the resources needed to sustain armies. Every poet who celebrated imperial unity inadvertently strengthened the resolve required for the contests that lay ahead. By the time the Sangama era neared its end, all the elements of Vijayanagara's cultural world had aligned into something powerful. A confident capital, loyal commanders, prosperous provinces, thriving markets, revitalized sacred centers, and a court whose artistic output had become the pride of the southern peninsula. Yet these achievements unfolded under the shadow of a rivalry that could no longer be postponed. The Raishur region, fertile, strategic, fiercely coveted, held the tension taut. The Bahmanes watched, calculated, and waited. Vijayanagara prepared, strengthened, and advanced. Neither side would withdraw. The time was coming when diplomacy and border skirmishes would no longer suffice. And as the Sangama dynasty reached its final decades, the empire found itself standing at the threshold between growth and confrontation, ready to enter a new era shaped not only by culture and administration, but by the clash of two powers destined to collide. Not every empire realizes the moment when its peak has passed. Vijayanagara entered its years of decline, with celebrations still echoing through the capital, guards still patrolling strong gates, and markets still so crowded at midday that a traveler could barely move through them. Nothing in Hampi's dazzling streets suggested danger. The city looked invincible. The empire looked permanent. But beneath the pageantry, something essential had begun to shift. Quietly, subtly, and far from the eyes of those who believed the Sangama name could carry itself forward forever. The earliest signs appeared not in the capital, but along the distant frontiers. Reports arrived from the Raishur Doab, written by commanders who sounded more cautious than usual. Notes about patrols taking longer routes, supply caravans delayed by days, fort captains requesting reinforcements earlier than expected. None of these warnings felt alarming on their own. Each seemed manageable. Yet woven together, they revealed a frontier beginning to strain under a court that no longer responded with the speed or unity it once commanded. Inside the palace, the change became clearer. The generation of leaders who had served Buka and Harihara, men who had built the empire with discipline and resolve, were now gone. Their successors inherited power without inheriting the hardships that had once shaped it. The court became noisier, more divided, its halls filled with arguments over precedence and influence instead of strategy. Decisions that once took hours now stretched into days, as nobles weighed not what was best for the empire, but what was best for their faction. This atmosphere seeped into every layer of governance. A decree issued in the capital might be interpreted differently in 3 separate provinces. Messages sent to frontier commanders returned with questions instead of obedience. Noble families who had once cooperated out of necessity now revived forgotten rivalries. Even festival processions, which had always united the city in celebration, began to reflect these subtle fractures. Groups marched separately, rather than blending into the unified spectacle that had long symbolized Vijayanagara's strength. The empire's structure, built on a vast network of Nayakas, began to wobble under these conditions. These military governors had played an essential role during the era of expansion, holding forts, maintaining armies, and governing key territories with considerable autonomy. Their loyalty had once been anchored by strong kings and consistent oversight, but as central authority weakened, many Nayakas saw room to assert themselves. Some delayed paying dues to the capital, claiming regional needs were more urgent. Others increased the size of their personal retinues without authorization. A few quietly ignored directives altogether. No single Nayaka declared open rebellion, but their collective shift created a dangerous reality. The empire was beginning to behave as though it were several competing states, rather than one regions that had once mirrored Hampi's prosperity, now looked inward, preparing for a future where the center could no longer guarantee stability. As this internal weakening unfolded, the Bahmani Sultanate to the north observed everything with careful precision. Their scouts noted changes along the frontier, garrisons rotating more slowly, fort repairs taking longer, patrols covering smaller stretches of riverbank. The Bahmanis had long recognized Vijayanagara as their greatest rival. Now they sensed that the great southern empire was approaching a vulnerable phase. Raicha became the measure of this vulnerability. Control of the Doab had always been contested, but now each skirmish seemed to push Vijayanagara backward by a fraction. A tower abandoned for a day took a week to reclaim. A fortress that once held firm now requested reinforcements sooner. These losses were small, but they reflected a larger shift. Vijayanagara's reaction time, once its greatest strength, had slowed. Inside the capital, the court attempted to project unity. Ceremonial events continued with the same grandeur as before. Gopurams still towered over Hampi like mountains of carved stone, and the empire's rituals carried on with their usual thunder of drums and flash of color. But the people who attended these ceremonies were not the same as those who had helped build the empire. Younger nobles, raised in an era of luxury rather than hardship, spent more time competing for titles and wealth than planning frontier strategy. Councils meant for military discussions dissolved into debates over influence. Even minor decisions, appointments, tax adjustments, the transfer of a single commander, became fuel for factional arguments. These divisions reached their peak when a series of court intrigues erupted between rival houses. Whispered accusations spread along palace corridors. Alliances formed behind closed doors. Decisions that once protected the empire now served to protect reputations or punish rivals. The atmosphere grew tense enough that even casual observers sensed something was wrong. Outside Hampi, provincial leaders began to worry. Governors who had long relied on the capital's strength now questioned whether support would arrive when needed. Some responded by building stronger local defenses. Others hoarded grain or withheld troops. These acts were not declared as rebellion, but they clearly signaled mistrust. The empire's merchants, always quick to sense shifts in stability, began diversifying their routes to hedge against uncertainty. They continued supplying the capital, but they expanded operations in coastal regions or developed new ties with emerging local powers. Trade still flowed, but its patterns quietly changed. The city remained prosperous, yet the underlying currents were no longer entirely in Vijayanagara's favor. Amid this atmosphere of uncertainty, one figure remained focused on the empire's survival: Tuluva Narasimha. While others argued or maneuvered for influence, he traveled between the capital and the frontiers, assessing the damage firsthand. He saw the delays in reinforcement, the wavering loyalty of some Nayakas, the slow response from court officials, and the shifting confidence of provincial leaders. Soldiers respected him, partly because he refused to be drawn into court politics, and partly because he fought alongside them while many nobles remained comfortably inside Hampi. Narasimha's reputation grew naturally. Every successful defense against Bahmani incursions increased his influence. Every province that requested his intervention, instead of relying on the court, added to his authority. Slowly, he became the unofficial stabilizer of the empire, a role no Sangama king seemed able to fulfill. As instability increased, Narasimha began to receive quiet visits from individuals who believed the empire was approaching a dangerous precipice. Some were Nayakas, worried about their territories. Others were palace officials who no longer trusted the king's closest advisors. They came not to rebel, but to warn him. Unless someone intervened, Vijayanagara could fracture beyond repair. These meetings did not immediately push Narasimha toward drastic action. But as season after season passed without improvement, the reality became impossible to ignore. Bahmani incursions grew more confident. Some Nayakas began acting as semi-independent rulers. Court factions hardened into rival camps. Revenue from critical regions slowed. Grain shortages appeared in areas that had not seen scarcity in decades. Even the capital's festivals, always symbols of unity, carried a different mood, as though the empire celebrated out of habit rather than optimism. Through all this, the Sangama kings held the throne in name, but not in influence. Their proclamations lacked weight. Their commands lacked urgency. Their authority, once the anchor of the empire, had become ceremonial. The pressures converged in a single, undeniable truth. Vijayanagara could not endure much longer under its current leadership. And when that truth became impossible to overlook, Tuluva Narasimha stood positioned at the center of the crisis, not as a rival seeking power, but as the only figure capable of preventing the empire from breaking apart entirely. The decline of the Sangama dynasty had reached its breaking point. What came next would reshape Vijayanagara's future and determine whether the empire survived at all. Crisis has a way of sharpening the silhouettes of powerful men. When the Sangama dynasty faltered and the court descended into rivalry, Tuluva Narasimha emerged not because he sought the throne, but because no one else could hold the empire together. His rise did not begin with grand declarations or secret conspiracies. It began with the simple, unavoidable reality that whenever something went wrong, along the frontiers, in rebellious territories, or inside the capital, He was the one people turned to. At first, Narasimha resisted the role others imagined for him. He had served the empire long enough to understand how quickly ambition could swallow a noble, and how easily violence could follow a political misstep, but events pressed against him from every side. Reports from the Raishur Doab grew more alarming. Some Nayakas withheld troops needed for frontier defense. Messages from provincial leaders revealed that the treasury's failure to distribute resources had caused unrest in multiple regions. And inside Hampi, the crown itself had become more symbol than authority, its decisions overshadowed by noble factions treating the court like a battlefield. In the midst of this erosion, Narasimha performed the tasks he had always done, visiting troubled provinces, reorganizing garrisons, negotiating with local chiefs, repairing strained alliances. He did not make speeches or issue proclamations. Instead, he acted, and his actions shaped the perception that he alone understood how to hold the empire upright as the old order crumbled. The first decisive shift came when a cluster of important forts along the northern frontier reported simultaneous pressure from Bahmani forces. Ordinarily, such a crisis would have demanded immediate support from the capital. Instead, the court hesitated, delayed by infighting, disagreements over which faction controlled the necessary troops, and debates about who should lead the response. By the time a decision was nearly reached, it was already too late. The Bahmanis had seized positions that would take months to reclaim. Narasimha did not wait for further instructions. He gathered men loyal to him, soldiers, minor commanders, provincial guards, and marched north. His arrival steadied the region quickly. Fort captains who had lost hope recommitted themselves once they saw him. Nayakas who had acted independently now responded to his presence with renewed discipline. Even rival powerholders recognized that without Narasimha's intervention, the frontier would have collapsed completely. When he returned to the capital, the people along his route greeted him with the kind of respect they had once reserved for the founding kings. They saw in him the resilience their rulers had lost. Word of this traveled faster than the man himself, and by the time he reached Hampi, many nobles already suspected that the balance of power had shifted in ways the Sangama household could no longer control. The king still sat on the throne, but his influence had been eroded by years of poor decisions and internal strife. His counselors were divided, his commands often ignored, and his judgment questioned by those who once would have defended him. Narasimha attempted to stabilize the situation without directly confronting the crown. He understood that a reckless move could throw the empire into civil war, but the court's dysfunction made neutrality impossible. Tensions inside the palace reached a breaking point when reports arrived of a major Nayaka refusing to release troops for a northern campaign unless granted expanded territory and privileges. The king hesitated, unsure whether enforcing discipline would provoke rebellion or whether conceding would weaken the throne further. While he hesitated, the Bahmanis exploited the delay, pressing deeper into contested lands. The court erupted into blame. Noble factions accused one another of sabotaging the war effort. Provincial leaders prepared for the possibility of having to defend themselves without support. In that moment of paralysis, Narasimha understood what the empire had already decided. Authority needed to return to someone capable of wielding it. The dynasty's survival instincts might have kept the king in place, but the empire's survival required action. The coup unfolded not with dramatic violence, but with cold clarity. Narasimha's supporters, many of whom had grown weary of the court's splintered leadership, secured key positions in the capital guards. Loyal to him, replaced those guarding the palace gates. Messengers were intercepted before rival factions could rally. By the time dawn rose over the granite hills, the king had been isolated from power, his authority reduced to ceremonial presence. The transition was swift, not because Narasimha was ruthless, but because nearly everyone recognized the necessity of his intervention. The alternative was dissolution. With the Sangama king effectively removed from power, Narasimha stepped into the role the empire had been pushing toward him for years. His task was not to celebrate his rise, but to confront the mountain of difficulties waiting in every direction. The frontier needed reinforcement. The court needed restructuring. The treasury had to be stabilized, and perhaps most critically, the Nayakas needed to be brought back into alignment before their growing autonomy fractured the empire beyond repair. He began by purging the court of men whose ambitions had fueled the chaos. Some were stripped of influence and quietly sent away. Others were reassigned to distant provinces, where their capacity for intrigue diminished. Narasimha restored councils that had fallen into dysfunction, and appointed administrators known more for discipline than for charm. These actions did not go unnoticed. Word spread through the capital that the new ruler was determined to restore clarity, even if it meant unsettling powerful factions. Many welcomed the shift, others watched warily, unsure how far his reforms would reach. From the court, he turned to the frontiers. Garrisons that had been undersupplied received new shipments of grain, arrows, and armor. Engineers were sent to repair fort walls. Long-neglected cavalry units were reorganized under commanders who had proven reliable in earlier campaigns. For the first time in years, soldiers stationed along the contested lands felt supported. Their renewed confidence translated into stronger patrols, quicker responses, and fewer losses. The Bahmanis, sensing the shift, scaled back their immediate aggression. In the provinces, Narasimha enforced discipline with a combination of firmness and strategy. Nayakas who had drifted toward independence were summoned to the capital and compelled to reaffirm loyalty through tribute, service, or restructured agreements. Those who resisted were dealt with swiftly. Some had their lands reassigned, while others found themselves facing Narasimha's forces directly. His intent was not to punish, but to re-establish a chain of command that had unraveled dangerously. As news of his actions spread, doubtful commanders reconsidered rebellion. They understood that the new ruler was neither hesitant nor easily manipulated. These reforms produced an immediate, visible effect. Agricultural districts that had faltered began to recover as irrigation systems received attention. Trade routes reopened fully. Temple towns enjoyed renewed support. The capital, which had lived under a cloud of uncertainty, regained its sense of purpose. Caravans arrived in greater numbers, and the markets hummed with cautious optimism. People who had feared a slow descent into chaos began to believe the empire might stand strong again. But stability came with its own challenges. Narasimha's authority was not yet absolute. The Sangama dynasty still occupied the throne in name, and though their power was symbolic, symbols mattered. Some nobles remained loyal to the old order and spoke quietly of restoring Sangama rule. Others resented Narasimha's direct approach and quietly tested the boundaries of his reforms. The Bahmani Sultanate, though temporarily restrained, had splintered internally and was giving rise to successor states whose ambitions were unpredictable. The empire's stability, though improving, remained fragile. Amid these tensions, Narasimha faced a challenge more personal and more destabilizing than any external threat: succession. Despite his talent for governance and warfare, he knew that no ruler could restore the empire alone. He needed a clear plan for the future. Yet when illness struck him earlier than expected, that plan had not been finalized. His sons were young, untested, and surrounded by opportunists who saw their youth as an advantage. As Narasimha's health faltered, court factions stirred again. Some saw a chance to reclaim influence. Others sought to manipulate the young heirs. Despite Narasimha's attempts to secure their guardianship under trusted allies, rival interests worked tirelessly to shape the outcome once the ruler's decline became undeniable. When Narasimha died, the transition unfolded exactly as he had feared. The young heirs, lacking both experience and support, became pawns in a political arena that would consume them. Court factions reawakened with renewed ferocity. Hidden rivalries surged back to the surface, and while the Sangama dynasty had lost control through weakness, the Tuluva line now threatened to lose control through vulnerability. Into this vacuum stepped a man whose influence had grown steadily in the final years of Narasimha's rule. The regent and commander, Tuluva Narasa Nayaka. He had served loyally under Narasimha, stabilizing regions, organizing defenses, and commanding soldiers who trusted his judgment. With the young heirs caught between predators on every side, Narasa Nayaka acted decisively, positioning himself as their protector. But protection came at a cost. As Narasa Nayaka assumed control, the question of who truly ruled Vijayanagara shifted again. The Tuluva heirs held the throne in name, yet the authority of leadership was passing to someone outside their lineage. A transition that would set the stage for an entirely new dynasty, one that would carry the empire toward its greatest heights. For now, though, the Tuluva interregnum stood at a crossroads, an empire temporarily saved, yet far from settled, guided by men who held the realm together through sheer resolve, while the old order dissolved behind them. Change in Vijayanagara began quietly, not with a clash of armies or the fall of a capital, but through the realization that order depended on a man who was neither king nor heir. When Tuluva Narasimha died, the empire paused on uncertain ground. The late ruler's reforms had restored balance, but the structure he built relied on constant vigilance. Without him, the court drifted, unsure which voice to follow, unsure how firmly to speak. The young heirs could not command the allegiance of an empire shaped by war and ambition, and while the Sangama decline had been slow and tangled, the transition after Narasimha's death unfolded with a clarity that revealed how fragile the realm remained. Narasa Nayaka stepped into this landscape without ceremony. His presence carried the weight of years spent on battlefields, caravans, river crossings, and fortress walls. Soldiers knew him as the man who appeared when situations were worst. Commanders recognized his judgment. Provincial leaders understood that he acted quickly, without hesitation or vanity. These qualities mattered more than lineage, as the empire braced for the turbulence that followed the loss of the Tuluva patriarch. The court, however, became restless almost immediately. Ministers who had kept silent under Narasimha's disciplined authority began reviving their ambitions. Advisors clustered around the young heirs, each group trying to shape the regency from behind the scenes. Messages arrived from distant provinces, reporting disputes the capital no longer responded to with confidence. The calm Narasimha had enforced began to slip, replaced by the same tension that had plagued the final Sangama years. Narasa did not rush to fill the void. He understood the danger of acting too quickly. Instead, he observed how the court moved, who aligned with whom, which nobles sought to gain control of the young princes, which Nayakas were beginning to push against the boundaries of their authority. When he finally acted, he moved with deliberate precision. Loyal guards replaced uncertain ones. Communication lines were reorganized so messages from the frontier reached him first. Access to the young heirs tightened, making it clear that their protection lay in his hands, not in the shifting agendas of nobles. Once these changes settled, he stepped forward as the regent in practice, if not by formal declaration. Those who opposed him hesitated, sensing that the empire needed exactly the kind of leadership he represented. Those who supported him welcomed the clarity he brought, and those who feared him kept their objections quiet, understanding that the memory of recent instability was still too fresh for the court to risk a confrontation with the man responsible for restoring order. With controls secured, Narasa faced the immediate challenges that had reappeared after Narasimha's death. Some Nayakas believed the transition offered an opportunity to strengthen their own positions. They delayed tribute. They expanded their private armies. A few made tentative alliances with neighboring powers, testing how far they could stretch their autonomy before the capital reacted. Narasa moved quickly. He traveled from district to district, appearing without warning in forts that had grown complacent or defiant. His approach varied with the nature of each situation. Where a Nayaka simply hesitated out of uncertainty, Narasa offered reassurance and renegotiated obligations. Where a commander attempted to consolidate personal authority, he responded with firmness. In several regions, he reorganized garrisons, redistributed land rights, or revoked privileges entirely. Rebellions dissolved before they could take shape. These measures created a new atmosphere across the empire. People began to speak of a center that had regained its strength. Markets reopened fully, caravans resumed travel without fear of armed interference, and provincial leaders realized that governance no longer bent under the weight of indecision. Even the temple towns, always sensitive to political change, adapted quickly to Narasa's rule. Support returned to institutions that had suffered under factional chaos. Ritual calendars were restored, festivals resumed, and old patronage lines, disrupted during the Sangama decline, began to function again. While internal order improved, Narasa remained alert to the situation beyond the empire's borders. The Bahmani Sultanate had splintered into separate states. Bijapur, Ahmadnagar, Golconda, Bidar, and Berar, each rising with ambitions forged from the collapse of their parent court. This fragmentation did not weaken the Deccan. It sharpened it. Every successor state wanted to prove itself. Each cultivated its cavalry, strengthened its cities, expanded its alliances, and prepared to seize advantage wherever Vijayanagara faltered. Narasa understood that confronting these powers prematurely would only exhaust the empire. Instead, he fortified key positions along the Raichur frontier. Fort walls were repaired, supply systems reorganized, and commanders appointed who followed his directives without hesitation. Scouts monitored the movement of Deccan armies with new discipline. If any of the successor states considered advancing southward, they would meet an empire ready to respond rather than one distracted by internal collapse. Even Hampi changed under his leadership. The capital reflected the returning sense of stability. Its avenues once again filled with merchants who trusted the roads. Markets grew busier. Smithies and workshops operated late into the evenings. The sound of construction, the familiar tapping of chisels against granite, once again echoed across neighborhoods where repairs had stalled during the period of uncertainty. Travelers arriving in the city felt the difference immediately. Vijayanagara no longer seemed like a realm drifting between outcomes. It felt directed, but strengthening the empire came with a responsibility Narasa had not sought: the future of the throne itself. The young Tuluva heirs showed little sign of developing the resolve needed to govern. They remained ceremonial figures, overshadowed at every turn by the man ensuring the empire's survival. Their youth instead of inspiring sympathy, exposed a deeper issue. Vijayanagara had outgrown rulers who relied on the memory of dynastic legitimacy rather than the substance of leadership. Narasa did not openly challenge the dynasty. He maintained the appearance of loyalty, attending ceremonies, upholding titles, and ensuring that the heirs received proper education and protection. But he understood, as did many in the court, that the empire's strength no longer flowed from their authority. It flowed from the systems he had repaired and the stability he enforced. His own family began to stand out as a result of this shift. His sons grew into adulthood surrounded by the structures he had rebuilt: military, administrative, religious, and economic. They carried the confidence of men raised to rule in a world shaped by their father's discipline. Commanders noticed them. Nobles observed them. The people in the capital whispered about the difference between the ineffective heirs and the rising Tuluva line that seemed to possess the qualities the empire now required. But Narasa did not rush to turn this observation into a claim. He knew how quickly a misstep could unravel everything. Instead, he focused on ensuring that the empire functioned smoothly, as though preparing the ground for a transition that needed no announcement. He reorganized tax districts to secure steady revenue. He encouraged loyal nobles to supervise regions prone to unrest. He strengthened the administrative centers in newly stabilized provinces. With each passing season, the empire grew less dependent on the memory of past rulers and more reliant on the emerging Tuluva structure he had shaped. Yet time pushed the question forward with increasing urgency. Narasa's health weakened. Factions that had remained subdued began to stir. Again, nobles who once bowed to him now whispered among themselves, calculating how to shape the next era. The Tuluva heirs, though still nominal rulers, could not contain these tensions. The empire had accepted Narasa's authority, not theirs. When Narasa died, the capital felt the shift instantly. Stability had depended on his presence, and without him, the balance wavered. Split loyalties re-emerged. Court agents maneuvered to influence the next direction of power. The young Saluvas, outmatched by circumstance, found themselves pushed aside by the very processes they could not control. And in that moment of uncertainty, one figure stood ready, the man who had learned governance at his father's side, who commanded the loyalty of the armies, who had inherited not only territory, but the trust that Narasa's leadership had earned. A new dynasty was about to rise. The Tuluva era had begun its first quiet heartbeat. The empire did not recognize the magnitude of its turning point when Narasa Nayaka's son assumed control. The transition had none of the spectacle that usually marked the rise of a new dynasty. There were no overwhelming declarations or grand ceremonies, only a quiet acknowledgement from those who mattered that leadership had passed into hands capable of shaping the next era. Among those hands, one pair stood out more clearly than any other. Krishnadevaraya emerged not through inheritance alone, but through presence. He carried the steadiness of a man shaped by years, spent moving between training grounds, provincial courts, frontier garrisons, and temple towns. He had learned discipline from his father, strategy from commanders who respected him, and resilience from witnessing the empire's earlier decline. When he ascended, he offered not a promise, but a direction, one that the empire recognized instinctively. His coronation unfolded with deliberate grandeur, not to celebrate his rise, but to signal to the world that Vijayanagara had entered a new phase. The capital's wide avenues filled with banners so vivid they seemed to glow under the morning light. Elephants draped in embroidered cloth moved alongside soldiers in ceremonial formation. The city's temples resonated with drums that pulsed through the streets and carried out to the hills. When Krishnadevaraya took his seat, the court, the provinces, and even distant neighbors understood that Vijayanagara would not continue as it had before. It would reach for something far greater. His first decisions reflected that certainty. He turned immediately to the regions whose instability threatened to undermine everything. Rebellious chiefs, uncertain commanders, and local lords who had taken advantage of the previous transition. The Umatur chiefs were among the first to feel his resolve. Their defiance, long tolerated out of necessity, ended when Krishnadevaraya rode into the region with an army organized with precision his predecessors had rarely achieved. The campaign was swift and decisive. Forts taken by the rebels were reclaimed, and local leaders were compelled to reaffirm loyalty. The message spread. The new emperor governed with purpose, and hesitation would not find room to grow. From the south, he turned to the Deccan. The successor states of the Bahmani Sultanate had hardened into formidable powers in their own right. Each sought control of strategic corridors, cavalry routes, and fort chains that shaped the plateau's balance. Vijayanagara and its rivals understood that peace was fragile and that every campaign carried lasting consequences. Krishnadevaraya stepped into this rivalry without caution. He studied the politics of the Deccan, mapped the alliances between sultanates, and prepared for a conflict that would define his reign. His early battles established the pattern that would shape his legend. Rapid mobilization, carefully chosen sites of engagement, and an unyielding pursuit of decisive victory. Kondavidu became one such theatre. The fortress, perched above the plains, had shifted between rulers as frequently as fortunes shifted between kingdoms. When Krishnadevaraya marched on it, he brought an army that had been drilled relentlessly under his command. His forces maneuvered across terrain difficult enough to discourage a lesser ruler, yet he pushed forward, coordinating infantry, cavalry, and siege engines with confident rhythm. The defenders held as long as they could, but once the outer lines fell, the rest followed. That victory reverberated across Andhra, pulling new territories into Vijayanagara's orbit. No triumph, however, influenced the region as deeply as the conflict over the Raichur Doab. The fertile land between the Krishna and Tungabhadra had been the pivot of Deccan rivalry for generations under Krishnadevaraya. The empire reclaimed it with a force that startled neighboring courts. His army crossed the river with disciplined formations, tightened its control over the approaches, and broke through the fort's defenses in a siege remembered for the sheer coordination between infantry blocks, archers, and cavalry units. In reclaiming the Doab, he reasserted Vijayanagara's command over the heart of the plateau, demonstrating to every rival that the empire had returned to full strength. From the Deccan, his attention shifted eastward again to the Gajapati kingdom. The conflict was not new, tensions had simmered for decades, but under Krishnadevaraya, the confrontation transformed into a decisive campaign. Coastal forts, river crossings, and hill passes fell under his control. When major strongholds capitulated, the campaign opened the path for Vijayanagara to press deeper into lands that had long resisted southern influence. Each conquest expanded the empire, not only in territory, but in confidence. Yet Krishnadevaraya's power did not rest solely on the edge of a sword. While his armies secured the frontiers, his court evolved into a center of creativity, unmatched anywhere else in the South. Poets from every major linguistic tradition found patrons willing to support their work. Scholars debated in halls designed for both ceremony and study. Artists shaped stone with a boldness inspired by the emperor's own vision. Temple architecture flourished, with towering gopurams rising along sacred routes and new mandapas, expanding the ritual spaces of the capital. The empire's cultural richness also shaped its administration. Krishnadevaraya recognized that a realm of Vijayanagara's scale required a system capable of adapting to its diverse regions, so he strengthened the Nayaka structure. These commanders, once simply military governors, became responsible for maintaining stability across wide stretches of territory. They collected revenue, oversaw military recruitment, repaired local fortifications, and encouraged economic growth. Their power grew, but so did their accountability. Those who served with loyalty received support and recognition. Those who faltered were replaced with men who understood the weight of their responsibilities. This balance allowed Vijayanagara to maintain unity across a vast and varied landscape. The prosperity generated under his rule passed through every layer of the empire. In the capital, markets overflowed with textiles, spices, carved works, and metal goods. New irrigation systems allowed fields to produce more than ever before. Roads connecting distant regions received repairs and extensions, strengthening links between coast, plateau, and interior. Caravans traveling between districts found the routes safer, the rest stations more organized, and the local administrators more responsive. The rhythm of daily life quickened under the security of predictable governance. Diplomacy also shaped Krishnadevaraya's reign. He approached neighboring powers with a mixture of caution and confidence, recognizing that a single misjudgment could destabilize the delicate balance of the Deccan. Some relationships were cemented through marriages that reinforced alliances or eased tensions between noble houses. Others were maintained through carefully managed negotiations, ceremonial exchanges, or displays of imperial grandeur. Royal processions, staged with deliberate extravagance, sent a clear message. Vijayanagara was open to cooperation, but not to compromise in matters of strength. These processions served as more than political signals. They allowed the emperor to present himself to his people, not as a distant figure hidden behind palace walls, but as a ruler whose presence extended across the empire. Citizens gathered along the roads to witness the horses, elephants, banners, guards, and musicians that accompanied him. The spectacle reaffirmed the unity of the realm, reminding every observer that their fortunes were tied to the empire's stability. But even in an era of triumph, shadows gathered slowly. Years of constant campaigning took a toll. Krishnadevaraya, once tireless, began to experience the strain of leading an empire whose borders seemed always in motion. Courtiers noticed changes in his pace, in the length of his councils, in the time it took him to recover between campaigns. Illness struck intermittently, each episode leaving him weakened before he forced himself back into his routine. As his strength diminished, old tensions resurfaced. Some factions looked toward his likely successors and began carefully positioning themselves. Others hesitated, uncertain whether the emperor would choose a clear heir or let the matter unfold through political maneuvering. His illness brought unease, not panic, but enough uncertainty to remind the court that the empire's golden age depended heavily on a single man's endurance. Despite these growing uncertainties, Krishnadevaraya continued to govern with purpose. His final years were marked by the same resolve that had defined his rise: fortifying the empire, supporting temple building, encouraging artistic production, and preparing the state for the challenges ahead. He could not know how quickly the political landscape would shift after his reign, but he ensured that the foundations he strengthened would endure for as long as possible. His late decisions, however, could not prevent the tension that slowly gathered behind the scenes. When illness tightened its hold, the imperial court began to anticipate the inevitable. Rivalries became sharper. Loyalties became more fluid. and the path to succession, never straightforward in Vijayanagara, prepared to draw the empire into its next phase. For now, though, the realm still stood in the light of his achievements. Vijayanagara's power stretched across rivers, mountains, and coasts. Its festivals, armies, temples, and markets reflected a unity rare in the region's turbulent history, and at the center of it all stood a ruler whose legacy would shape the empire's identity long after he was gone. Krishnadevaraya's golden age had reached its height. Brilliant, expansive, and undeniable, what followed would test every structure he had built. When Krishnadevaraya's reign finally gave way to the rule of his successor, the empire did not collapse or tremble. It drifted into a quieter, more uncertain rhythm. The streets of Hampi were still crowded. The markets still rang with the sound of metalworkers and merchants. The gopurams still cast long shadows at sunset. Nothing seemed broken at first glance. Yet those who had lived through the emperor's campaigns felt the difference immediately. The relentless certainty that once guided Vijayanagara had faded, replaced by a delicate balance that shifted with every decision, every pause, every hesitation at court. The new ruler, Achyuta Devaraya, stepped into a world shaped entirely by the brilliance of his predecessor. Krishnadevaraya had left behind an empire that seemed unshakable, forts standing firm across the Deccan, prosperous provinces, loyal Nayakas, and a capital whose splendor drew visitors from near and far. But the very scale of these achievements left Achyuta with the burden of comparison. Every noble expected stability to continue as easily as a festival procession. Every commander assumed the empire would move as one. Just as it had under the earlier reign, Achyuta inherited expectations that no ruler could fulfill alone. At court, the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing month. Advisors who had once followed Krishnadevaraya's lead now drifted toward rival factions. Some whispered that Achyuta lacked the intensity needed to maintain imperial momentum. Others saw opportunity in the uncertainty and began positioning themselves for influence. The court divided along subtle lines. Loyalty to the emperor, loyalty to old alliances, loyalty to hopes of future succession. None of these disputes erupted openly, but they shaped every council meeting and colored every decision the new ruler made. Achyuta's early policies carried echoes of his predecessor's approach, but the consistency that had defined earlier rule proved difficult to match. He faced the same challenges: restless chiefs, shifting alliances among Deccan sultanates, tensions within newly integrated territories. But the confidence that once guided imperial responses was no longer present. Some directives came too late. Others came too early. A few arrived just in time, but lacked the force needed to command lasting obedience. As uncertainty accumulated inside the capital, the provinces began to sense the change. Nayakas who had served faithfully under Krishnadevaraya now wondered how firmly the court would enforce expectations. Some continued acting with discipline, recognizing that the empire remained strong even if its leadership faltered. Others tested limits. They delayed remitting revenue, expanded their retinues more aggressively, or offered polite excuses when called to the capital. Their actions were small but revealing. Each one chipped at the unity Krishnadevaraya had enforced with such clarity. Nowhere was this shift felt more sharply than along the empire's northern edge. The successor sultanates of the Deccan had grown more confident in recent years. They watched Vijayanagara carefully, studying every change in leadership, every rumor of weakened command, every fluctuation in troop movements near the frontier. Under Krishnadevaraya, they had adapted with caution and maintained defensive strategies. knowing direct confrontation would end poorly. Under Akyuta, they sensed opportunity. The Raichur Doab, reclaimed with such determination during the Golden Age, once again became a measure of the Empire's resolve. The fields remained productive, the forts remained intact, and the soldiers stationed there remained committed. But the aura of unshakable control had diminished. When enemy scouts tested the borders, the Empire still pushed them back, but not with the same unmistakable force. When small raids struck frontier villages, the response arrived, but not always with immediate precision. These small cracks in reaction did not break the border, but they revealed that Vijayanagara's strength relied not only on military capacity, but on the confidence that leaders projected. Achyuta attempted to restore that confidence. He issued decrees reinforcing the roles of provincial governors. He invested resources in fort maintenance. He traveled across key regions to show presence and affirm unity. Yet each action seemed to spark new questions. Was the emperor acting from strength or necessity? Was the empire reinforcing the frontier as a demonstration of power or out of fear that the line might fail? These questions created tension within the ranks of the Nayakas. Some redoubled their loyalty, hoping to guide the empire through a transitional period. Others saw the uncertainty as a chance to reshape the political landscape. Rival claimants appeared, supported by nobles who believed they could maneuver more effectively under a different ruler. Achyuta's own family became entangled in disputes over precedence and legitimacy, further weakening the image of stable leadership. The capital mirrored these fractures. Hampi remained magnificent, but its mood changed. Festivals still illuminated the city, yet the energy behind them felt different. Processions continued, but conversations along the streets often turned to politics rather than celebration. Merchants still brought goods from across the peninsula, but they spoke more cautiously about long-term prospects. Even the artisans who carved stone for temples sensed the shift. Commissions continued, but they came with more negotiations, more discussions about priorities, more careful evaluations of cost and timing. Beyond the capital, regional leaders grew increasingly aware of the political currents. Those with strong personal followings used the moment to consolidate power locally. They strengthened their fortifications, expanded grain storage, and formed new alliances. While none openly defied the emperor, they clearly acted as though they expected greater instability ahead. The Deccan's sultanates, observing the same patterns, adjusted their posture. They increased their cavalry numbers, improved their siege equipment, and updated the organization of their frontline commanders. Some engaged in diplomatic exchanges with Vijayanagara, while quietly preparing for deeper conflict. Others subtly encouraged unrest along the empire's borderlands, hoping to weaken the southern power without committing to outright war. Their strategies took advantage of Vijayanagara's reluctance to escalate too quickly, knowing the empire was balancing internal friction and external pressures simultaneously. Amid these shifting dynamics, one figure gradually drew attention: Aliya Rama Raya. His connection by marriage to Krishnadevaraya's household gave him an initial foothold in court politics, but his rise did not depend on lineage alone. Rama Raya understood the rhythms of power, how alliances formed, how loyalties shifted, how commanders responded to strength or hesitancy. He maneuvered carefully, offering support to Achyuta when needed, showing decisiveness in situations where others hesitated, and forming ties with powerful Nayakas who sought a stronger voice in imperial affairs. His influence grew quietly at first. He resolved disputes the court could not address quickly. He mediated between feuding nobles. He reorganized administrative positions that had become entangled in rivalries. These actions earned him gratitude in some places and suspicion in others, but most importantly, they earned him visibility. As Achyuta's reign progressed, Rama Raya's role expanded. He accompanied the emperor on campaigns, presented proposals in council meetings, and negotiated with provincial leaders whose loyalty had become uncertain. His ability to act decisively made him a natural counterweight to the hesitations that plagued the imperial court. But while Rama Raya strengthened the empire's internal coherence, his rise also highlighted a troubling truth. Achyuta's authority was becoming increasingly ceremonial. Those who watched court politics closely recognized that actual decision-making was gradually passing into the hands of the rising statesmen. And as Achyuta struggled with internal disputes, the empire's borders grew more vulnerable. The final years of his reign felt stretched between two realities: an imperial structure still held together by its past achievements, and a growing sense that leadership needed to shift again to preserve what remained strong. The tension between these realities mirrored the empire itself, powerful, expansive, magnificent, yet strained by internal competition and external vigilance. By the time Achyuta's hold on power loosened, the empire had drifted far from the certainty that marked Krishnadevaraya's rule. The borders still held, but just barely. The provinces still contributed, but unevenly. The court still functioned, but through constant negotiation. And the nobles still pledged loyalty, but with caution in their words and calculation in their eyes. In the shadows of this shifting landscape, Rama Raya continued to rise, quietly, steadily, inevitably. And as the empire searched for direction, he stood ready to seize the moment that history was steadily shaping for him. Change rarely announces itself in the moment it begins. When Rama Raya first stepped into the wider machinery of statecraft, few recognized how deeply he would shape the empire's future. He entered the court through marriage ties linked to Krishnadevaraya's household, but lineage alone could not explain his ascent. His influence grew because he possessed a trait the empire desperately needed in its unsettled years: the ability to act decisively when everyone else hesitated. During Achyuta Devaraya's reign, uncertainty often filled the spaces where clarity should have stood. Each season brought fresh disputes among nobles, shifting alliances among Nayakas, and renewed pressure from the northern sultanates. Into this environment stepped Rama Raya, not with dramatic flair, but with a steadiness that became impossible to ignore. When rival families argued over territorial claims, he was the one who arranged workable boundaries. When commanders stalled over strategic choices, he offered plans that moved campaigns forward. When tensions rose between the court and the provinces, he bridged gaps others allowed to widen. These actions accumulated, granting him the kind of authority that emerges not from proclamation, but from usefulness. Achyuta relied on him more. Each year, Nayakas began seeking his mediation, even when the emperor was present. Administrators learned that proposals passing through his hands were more likely to reach implementation. His influence expanded not through force, but through the simple fact that the empire functioned better when he was involved. But reliance at court rarely develops without consequence. Some nobles resented Rama Raya's rising prominence and viewed him as an intrusion into their established networks. Others saw him as a long-term stabilizer who could prevent the empire from sliding into chaos. The court became a place of quiet calculations, support for him here, opposition there, cautious curiosity everywhere. Yet even those who resisted him recognized that the empire's immediate needs often aligned with his recommendations. As his influence deepened, Rama Raya turned his attention outward. Vijayanagara's stability depended not only on managing internal factions, but on its ability to navigate the shifting alliances of the Deccan. The successor sultanates, each ambitious, each eager to claim dominance, had entered a complex balance of rivalry and temporary cooperation. Their conflicts with one another offered opportunities. Their moments of unity posed dangers. Rama Raya understood that Vijayanagara could not ignore this changing landscape, so he began to cultivate relationships with these northern courts, sending envoys, hosting delegations, and forging personal ties with key figures across the plateau. These early connections were not dramatic enough to draw widespread attention, but they planted the seeds for a policy that would come to define the next era. Rama Raya's emerging strategy revolved around playing the Deccan powers against one another, carefully, deliberately, sometimes subtly, sometimes boldly. He believed that no single sultanate should grow strong enough to challenge Vijayanagara alone. If they quarreled with each other, the empire could maneuver freely. If they coordinated, the south would face a far more dangerous frontier. To keep that balance, he encouraged rivalries when needed, eased tensions when beneficial, and offered assistance selectively. Sometimes this meant supporting one sultanate's ambitions to check another. Sometimes it meant withdrawing backing just as the balance shifted. To his supporters, this was brilliant statecraft, an intricate dance that kept Vijayanagara dominant without committing to endless campaigns. To his critics, it was reckless, a game played too close to the fire. As this diplomatic pattern took shape, the internal power structure shifted as well. Rama Raya's authority grew more visible. He oversaw negotiations that would once have passed directly through the emperor. His role in military planning strengthened as commanders realized his counsel aligned with frontline realities. Even the court's ceremonial life changed subtly. His presence at ritual events, once merely expected, now carried weight, as nobles watched where he stood, who he greeted, and how he interpreted new developments. His military decisions reinforced his rising stature. In battles and skirmishes along the edges of the empire, his strategies favored adaptability and decisive strikes. While no single campaign defined his early military career, his consistent successes, small victories, quick responses, recalibrated deployments, built trust among commanders who had grown wary of the court's earlier uncertainties. They saw in him a man who understood both the battlefield and the demands of administering a vast, diverse kingdom. Yet even as he strengthened the empire, his methods carried long shadows. Vijayanagara began relying more heavily on foreign fighters, particularly skilled warriors who traveled across the plateau seeking service with whichever ruler paid best. Rama Raya recognized their value. They were disciplined, well-armed, and experienced in the fast-moving conflicts that characterized Deccan warfare. Under his guidance, the empire employed more of these mercenaries as elite cavalry units, archers, and support contingents. This strategy brought immediate military advantages, but it also created dependencies that some regarded with suspicion. A significant portion of the army now served because it was paid generously, not because it held ancestral loyalty to Vijayanagara. Rama Raya accepted this risk, believing that strength on the battlefield mattered more than maintaining outdated structures. Critics accused him of compromising the empire's fabric for short-term gains. Supporters called it necessary modernization. As these tensions simmered, the empire's administrative world mirrored the division. Some provincial leaders welcomed his decisiveness, finding him easier to work with than Achyuta. Others feared that his influence overshadowed the emperor too openly. A few saw him as the inevitable successor to practical authority, even if he never wore the crown. In many ways, this perception became reality. Achyuta began to withdraw from active governance, whether by choice or from exhaustion, and Rama Raya filled the space naturally. His rise accelerated after Achyuta's death. Succession disputes erupted immediately, fueled by competing claims, old resentments, and opportunistic nobles. While the court argued, Rama Raya moved quietly and effectively to shape the outcome. He supported the accession of a successor whose legitimacy he could uphold yet influence, ensuring continuity while preventing a return to destructive factionalism. His success in navigating the volatile transition earned him a reputation as the empire's stabilizing force, not the ruler, but the one who made rulership possible. From that moment onward, he became the empire's true center of gravity. The new emperor relied on him completely. Commanders listened to him first. Administrators implemented his directives. Provinces responded to his presence more quickly than to the king's. In every way, except formality, he stood at the head of the empire. This rise, however, did not go unnoticed in the Deccan. Sultanates that had once dealt with Vijayanagara cautiously now recognized that a new figure shaped southern policy, one whose tactics differed from Krishnadevaraya's disciplined conquest, or Achyuta's hesitant equilibrium. Rama Raya's willingness to manipulate alliances created both admiration and resentment. Some northern rulers cooperated readily, hoping to benefit from his schemes. Others grew wary, believing he sought to turn their rivalries into tools for his own ambition. As these concerns deepened, a subtle change occurred among the sultanates. Their bitterness toward one another did not disappear, but they began to understand a greater threat. If they continued to act alone, they would remain vulnerable to Rama Raya's political maneuvering. If they found common cause, even briefly, they might counter the influence that had shaped Deccan politics for years. This shift did not happen overnight. It formed slowly, through cautious conversations, shared frustrations, and the realization that Vijayanagara under Rama Raya had become more assertive, more daring, more unpredictable. The sultanates began testing cooperation in small ways: joint patrols, coordinated responses to border incidents, informal agreements to avoid escalation while focusing on common challenges. These movements were subtle but unmistakable. The Deccan was learning to unite when provoked. Back in the capital, Rama Raya continued to exercise authority with confidence, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that his policies were driving the northern sultanates toward a rare alignment. He believed Vijayanagara's strength, its wealth, and its deep military reserves would allow it to navigate whatever came next. Yet the empire's stability now rested heavily on him, and the alliances he manipulated were shifting in ways he had not anticipated. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike any Vijayanagara had faced before. Rama Raya had elevated the empire to new heights, but in doing so, he had also reshaped the political landscape of the Deccan in ways that would soon converge with devastating force. Along the northern frontier of Vijayanagara, torches glimmered on watchtowers, their flames bending in the wind as soldiers scanned the stretches of land beyond the riverbanks. From those high vantage points, the fields of the Raichur Doab seemed calm. Still crops, silent roads, distant hills wrapped in darkness. But veterans stationed there sensed an unfamiliar tension in the air, something that had not existed during Krishnadevaraya's confident marches. Word had begun to spread. The sultanates of the Deccan were speaking to one another more than they were quarreling. The change felt unnatural. This uneasy silence marked the beginning of a transformation that would soon engulf the entire empire. For decades, the Deccan powers, Bijapur, Ahmadnagar, Golconda, Bidar, and Berar had competed for prominence. Their rivalries had played directly into Vijayanagara's advantage. Whenever two of them quarreled, Ramaraya intervened with calculated precision. He mediated, pressured, supported, or withdrew, whatever the situation required to keep the balance tilted toward the south. It was a strategy that had yielded remarkable success until the sultanates recognized that the very game they were participating in allowed their rival to thrive. Conversations began in guarded tones. Military leaders compared the costs of constant conflict with one another. Advisors voiced concerns about Vijayanagara's growing influence across strategic corridors. When dispatches from their frontier scouts described how deeply the empire had embedded itself in the Doab, the sultanates finally understood the nature of their predicament. Maintaining rivalry meant ensuring Vijayanagara's dominance. Cooperation, however uneasy, offered a path to something none of them had achieved before: true leverage over the empire that had long dictated the rhythm of Deccan politics. This realization reshaped the plateau with surprising speed. Agreements formed between courts that had spent years exchanging threats. Commanders from rival states coordinated movements. Envoys who once traveled with cautious formality now spoke openly of shared objectives. None of these alliances were bound by trust. They were bound by recognition of a single common challenge. Their combined armies, if united on the field, could match or even exceed the power of Vijayanagara for the first time in generations. The empire's frontier commanders felt this shift before the court did. Patrols along the Krishna River reported increased activity, mounted scouts riding in broader arcs, supply caravans moving northward in greater numbers, and small contingents testing river crossings to gauge the strength of defensive outposts. The officers stationed in these regions sent messages to the capital urging caution, describing a landscape where rival sultanates moved with unusual coordination. These reports did not claim imminent war. They suggested something more unsettling: purpose. Inside Vijayanagara, the warnings sparked debate. Ramaraya had spent years manipulating divisions among the sultanates, and he believed the pattern remained intact. It was difficult for him, and for many at court, to imagine that these rivals had truly begun to align. Tension, yes. Posturing, certainly. But alliance? The idea seemed too unstable to sustain itself. He expected familiar cycles to resume: temporary cooperation, followed by renewed hostility. If anything, he interpreted their growing unity as an opportunity for the empire to demonstrate its strength once more. Despite his confidence, Ramaraya did not ignore the build-up entirely. He ordered muster rolls updated, strengthened select fort garrisons, and requested fresh levies from Nayakas, who controlled strategically located districts. Messengers traveled south and east to recall experienced contingents who had returned to their provinces after previous campaigns. These preparations were necessary, but they lacked the urgency that the frontier officers believed the situation demanded. In the weeks that followed, border tensions escalated. Small clashes erupted along a few disputed stretches of land. Nothing large enough to signal the beginning of a major conflict, but enough to unsettle soldiers who recognized the pattern. Probing maneuvers designed to map the empire's response time. When Sultanate cavalry rode closer to the frontier than usual, Vijayanagara's commanders scrambled to reposition their own units. Every movement exposed the empire's shifting internal dynamics. Some Nayakas complied quickly. Others delayed while assessing what advantage the moment might offer. If Vijayanagara had possessed complete unity, the tension might have de-escalated. But unity was precisely what the empire lacked. Rama Raya's authority was enormous, yet the loyalty that followed him was complex. Some powerful families supported him wholeheartedly. Others resented his influence, believing he overshadowed the throne. Several Nayakas began asking questions they had not dared voice earlier. How long would Rama Raya rule from behind the throne? And what would happen when his power inevitably faced a challenge from within? While these internal uncertainties simmered, reports from the frontier grew increasingly concerning. Scouts observed unfamiliar siege equipment being moved across the plateau, cavalry units trained in formations rarely used for routine patrols. Supply routes extended farther than usual, indicating preparations for a sustained campaign. This activity did not resemble the erratic pattern of previous raids. It resembled a coordinated strategy taking shape across multiple sultanates. Despite the mounting signs, Rama Raya projected confidence both publicly and within the court. He believed the empire's size, wealth, and martial tradition could withstand whatever challenge arose. He had led campaigns before. He had negotiated with sultanates that had sworn to oppose him. He had positioned himself as the empire's decisive force. Retreating now would signal weakness and embolden rivals. Thus, when additional warnings arrived, he responded by accelerating war preparations rather than reconsidering his broader approach. For the Nayakas, the call to assemble was both familiar and concerning. Many controlled districts that had prospered for decades. They had strengthened their armies, expanded their retinues, and maintained loyalty to Vijayanagara as long as leadership from the capital appeared decisive. Now, the situation was different. Joining a massive mobilization required them to leave their home territories vulnerable to rivals who might exploit their absence. Some obeyed immediately. Others hesitated, not from disloyalty, but from fear that uncertainty at court might produce consequences far beyond the battlefield. Even so, the imperial army began to gather. War elephants were brought from forested districts near the Ghats. Cavalry units assembled along roads leading toward the northern plains, infantry companies, drawn from the core regions and the newly stabilized provinces, marched toward designated meeting points. The scale of the mobilization reflected centuries of organizational development. Vijayanagara could still assemble one of the largest armies in the subcontinent when commanded to do so. As the force assembled, Rama Raya pushed forward with confidence. He believed the empire could force the sultanates into disunity again by confronting them before their cooperation solidified. Preparations accelerated across the capital. Armories worked through the night. Quartermasters inspected inventories of arrows, spearheads, javelins, and armor. The clatter of metal joined the constant hum of activity around the city's fortifications. The army moved slowly at first, not because of hesitation, but because of its size. Thousands of infantry had to pass through narrow mountain routes. War elephants required specialized handlers and constant supplies of water and fodder. Cavalry squadrons advanced alongside them, ensuring that no segment of the army remained exposed. Scouts rode ahead to map the terrain, confirm crossing points, and monitor enemy positions. The procession stretched for miles, a visible reminder of the Empire's reach. Yet the forces aligned against them were no less formidable. Ahmadnagar prepared elite cavalry trained for fast, coordinated strikes. Bijapur reinforced positions along likely approach routes. Golconda contributed siege expertise and experienced archers. Bidar and Berar, though smaller, added vital contingents and logistical resources. Individually, each state had long been manageable for Vijayanagara. United, they represented a challenge the empire had never faced before. As the sultanates' armies advanced, they moved with a sense of purpose that startled imperial scouts. Instead of disorganized waves, they formed coordinated columns. Instead of competing for position, they shared supplies. Instead of retreating at the first sign of pressure, they pressed forward deliberately. It became increasingly clear that this coalition intended not to harass Vijayanagara, but to confront it in a decisive engagement. When reports reached Ramaraya describing the scale of the enemy forces, he did not reconsider his approach. If anything, the information hardened his determination. The empire could not appear uncertain. A retreat would embolden the coalition and fracture the confidence of the Nayakas. Victory, and only victory, could protect Vijayanagara's authority across the south. Thus, the armies continued their march toward the plains of Talikota, the region chosen by fate for the coming confrontation. Lay at the confluence of roads, fields, and low ridges. It was a landscape that appeared deceptively simple at first glance. Gently sloping ground, broken by scattered elevations and shallow riverbeds. Yet its familiarity made it a natural meeting point. Soldiers on both sides had marched through it during earlier campaigns. It was terrain they understood well. But familiarity would not soften what awaited them. As both armies neared the site, the air changed. Dust rose in thick clouds from thousands of marching feet. The earth trembled beneath the weight of elephants moving into position. The wind carried the smell of campfires, oiled armor, and trampled grass. Tents spread across the plains in patterns influenced by each commander's traditions. Flags rose above them in bold colors. For the first time in generations, the Deccan's rival forces faced one another, not through intermittent raids, but across a field, ready for a decisive, terrible clash. Vijayanagara's soldiers sensed the magnitude of what lay ahead. Many had fought in earlier campaigns, but none had ever seen such a united front among the sultanates. War drums echoed across the plain as both armies prepared their positions. The road to catastrophe had reached its final, irreversible turn. Dawn approached with a pale, unsettling glow across the plains of Talikota. The faint light revealed the outlines of two armies facing each other across fields, already scarred by the movement of thousands. Vijayanagara's encampment stirred first, elephant handlers guiding massive animals toward the front, cavalry adjusting saddles, infantry tightening armor straps with the quiet, practiced tension of soldiers who understood what waited beyond the rising sun across the field. The coalition of Deccan sultanates prepared with equal determination, their formations locked into rigid precision, their banners snapping in the wind. Nothing about the morning suggested hesitation. Both sides had marched too far to consider retreat. As the sky brightened, drummers on both sides struck their instruments, not to intimidate, but to steady the minds of their own ranks. The sound carried across the plain, merging into a heavy, rhythmic pulse. Ramaraya, mounted at the center of his lines, surveyed the battlefield with the confidence that had guided him throughout his political life. His commanders stood beside him, prepared to execute a strategy that relied on disciplined formations and the strength of Vijayanagara's cavalry. The Empire's war elephants formed the front edge of the forward push, their tusks capped with armor fittings, their handlers whispering to them in low tones. Across the field, the Deccan coalition, organized with an efficiency that surprised even seasoned observers. They positioned cavalry in sweeping arcs, archers in staggered rows, and armored infantry at the core. Their formations reflected combined knowledge, each sultanate contributing its own strengths to create a unified whole. Once the sun rose fully above the horizon, the silence broke. The first exchange came as a thunderous volley of artillery. Cannons from the coalition roared, sending shockwaves across the plain and kicking dirt into the air. The Empire's artillery responded moments later, their blasts rolling across the field in answer. Smoke thickened quickly, drifting downward and shrouding the ground in a grey haze. The battle had begun. Vijayanagara's war elephants advanced first, their steps shaking the earth. Infantry followed closely behind, shields raised and spears angled forward. Rama Raya had long trusted the charge of these elephants to break enemy lines and create openings for cavalry to exploit. They moved with impressive force, pushing into the coalition's front ranks, scattering archers and forcing infantry to reposition. But the coalition was prepared. Their cavalry countered not by meeting the elephants head-on, but by sweeping around them, targeting handlers and vulnerable flanks. Arrows rained into the spaces between units. The elephants continued forward, but confusion rippled through their ranks as they encountered formations designed to absorb and redirect the momentum of such beasts. Vijayanagara's infantry closed in behind them, clashing with the coalition's front lines. The fighting turned fierce and immediate, shields splintering, spears breaking, swords striking against armor. Neither side yielded ground willingly. Dust rose in thick columns. War cries drowned out commands. The field transformed into a shifting mass of bodies, pushing and pulling in desperate rhythm. Amid this chaos, Vijayanagara's cavalry surged from the flanks, aiming to envelop the coalition's left side. For a moment, it seemed the maneuver would succeed. Riders pierced through gaps in the enemy's lines, scattering small contingents and forcing their opponents to reorganize. But before they could push deeper, the coalition deployed reinforcements from reserves held further back. Fresh cavalry charged at an angle, crashing into Vijayanagara's momentum and neutralizing the advantage the Empire had sought. Rama Raya watched these developments closely, adjusting his commands as the battle's shape changed. He believed that sustained pressure on multiple points would eventually break the coalition's coordination. If one segment faltered, the entire structure could unravel. That belief guided his decisions, but the coalition's discipline held. The decisive shift came not from the coalition's strength, but from a moment of betrayal within the Empire's own forces. Two contingents that had taken positions near Vijayanagara's center suddenly withdrew. Their retreat created a gap large enough for the coalition to exploit almost immediately. The commanders leading those units, men whose loyalty had wavered in the months preceding the battle, pulled back with haste, leaving exposed ground where the Empire's line should have held firm. Confusion rippled outward. Soldiers who expected support on their flanks found themselves surrounded. Officers attempted to redirect their men, but the opening widened too quickly. The coalition cavalry charged into the gap, splitting Vijayanagara's formation and driving a wedge between its left and right wings. Rama Raya recognized the danger instantly. He rode toward the collapsing section of the line, urging defenders to hold, calling for nearby units to close the breach. His presence stabilized a fraction of the chaos, but the breach had grown too large to seal. The coalition pressed harder, sending fresh infantry forward with determined pace. Dust swirled around him as he fought to regain order. The roar of battle drowned out nearly everything. Armor clashing, elephants trumpeting, commanders shouting for their scattered men. Yet even through the noise, a pattern emerged. Vijayanagara's front line was folding inward, pulled apart by pressure from forces that moved with unnerving coordination. As the wedge widened, coalition commanders recognized their moment. They pushed deeper, aiming not just to break the line, but to reach its center, where Rama Raya himself directed the battle. A surge of cavalry advanced toward him, cutting through defenders who struggled to hold formation. Rama Raya's own guards rallied around him, fighting fiercely to push the attackers back. For a brief period, They succeeded, creating enough space for the Emperor's ally to reposition his forces. But the numbers pressing against them grew too great. The battlefield shifted once more, this time toward inevitability. Ramaraya was surrounded. His horse stumbled under the pressure as attackers closed in. His guards fell one by one, fighting with a loyalty that had defined their service. Amid the chaos, the enemy's cavalry forced him from his mount. He continued fighting on foot, refusing to yield, even as the coalition tightened its grip. Eventually, he was taken captive, an outcome that signaled the approaching end. The coalition commanders moved swiftly. They executed Ramaraya near the front lines to prevent any attempt at rescue and to signal the end of his influence over Deccan politics. News of his death spread through Vijayanagara's ranks within moments, passing from soldier to soldier like a cold wind. Some refused to believe it. Others felt the ground shift beneath them. For many, the loss of their leader shattered whatever discipline remained. The imperial army broke. What began as a collapse in the center spread outward. Units that had fought bravely for hours now retreated in tumult. Officers shouted for order, but their voices could not be heard above the rising panic cavalry scattered in multiple directions. Elephants, once the pillars of the front line, became unpredictable, turning away or crashing through friendly ranks in fear and confusion. The coalition seized the opportunity, pressing forward relentlessly to prevent any chance of regrouping. Retreat became a chaotic flight southward. Squads abandoned equipment to move faster. Wounded soldiers struggled to keep up. Others fled alone, guided only by instinct. The dust thickened behind them as the coalition forces advanced, claiming the battlefield and everything that remained upon it. As survivors scattered across the plains, the route toward Hampi filled with those who had escaped the battle. They carried warnings, disbelief, and grief. Some arrived at the city gates hours before sunset, breathless and shaken. Others wandered in days later, bearing wounds and stories that grew heavier with each telling. The capital, long shielded from the worst of the Empire's conflicts, now faced a reality it had never imagined. Hampi was defenseless. The coalition advanced quickly, moving south with confidence born from victory. They encountered little organized resistance. Panic spread through villages along the route, prompting families to flee before the armies arrived. The approach toward the capital became a series of cascading evacuations, merchants rushing to gather goods, temple servants scrambling to protect sacred items, households attempting to salvage precious possessions. When the invaders reached Hampi, they entered a city whose greatness had stood for generations, a city shaped by stone, wealth, and belief. Its walls and temples, its markets and mansions, its massive waterworks and towering entranceways all fell before the force that descended upon it. The sack unfolded with the devastating speed of a storm, breaking across a landscape unprepared for its power. Temples lost carvings, painstakingly crafted by generations of artisans. Market streets were torn apart, palaces burned, reservoirs cracked. What had once been the center of southern civilization was transformed into silence and ruin. The capital that had supported an empire for 2 centuries collapsed in a matter of hours. When the destruction finally ceased, smoke continued to rise from shattered roofs, drifting above the granite hills like a funeral veil. Survivors gathered in the outskirts, staring at what remained of their home. Some knelt in disbelief. Others stood motionless, unable to comprehend the transformation. The city that had once seemed unbreakable now lay abandoned, its ruins stretching across the valley. Those who escaped fled southward, carrying with them the memory of a world that had vanished in a single day. The empire lived on, but the heart that once sustained it had been destroyed forever. Smoke still drifted above the shattered stones of Hampi when the surviving commanders gathered in the hills south of the ruined capital. They carried the weight of a catastrophe that had unfolded too quickly to comprehend, each man marked by grief, disbelief, or the hollow exhaustion of someone who had survived a world-ending night. The empire that once dominated the southern peninsula had lost its center, its armies, and its guiding force. Yet among the survivors stood the man who would take on the impossible task of keeping the remnants of Vijayanagara alive. Tirumala Deva Raya. He stepped forward, not as a conqueror, but as a guardian of what remained. Krishnadevaraya's lineage still ran through him, and in this moment of devastation, that connection gave weary commanders a figure to rally around. Tirumala did not pause to mourn publicly. He moved through the ranks of survivors, assessing losses, organizing retreat, and urging discipline so that panic would not tear apart what little unity the army still possessed. His voice carried a calm clarity that contrasted sharply with the chaos behind them. It was enough to bring order to men who had seen their empire broken in front of them. The journey south was slow and painful. Groups of wounded soldiers trailed behind the main column. Families from villages along the way joined the retreat, hoping the army's passage would offer some protection. Dust clung to everything: armor, clothing, hair, and silence replaced the usual hum of marching rhythms. When the column crossed the Tungabhadra, some paused to look north toward the ruins hidden beyond the horizon, as if expecting to see flames still rising. Others kept their gaze fixed ahead, unwilling to confront what they had lost. Tirumala chose Penukonda as the new seat of refuge. Its hilltop fortresses offered security that the exposed capital could no longer provide, and the terrain around it formed natural barriers against sudden attack. When the remnants of the imperial household reached the stronghold, the people there opened their gates with solemn urgency, understanding the magnitude of the moment. Palace officials found unused chambers to house surviving members of the royal family. Commanders re-established military formations. Administrators restarted record-keeping and treasury operations with whatever documents they had managed to save. The empire had not vanished. It had simply moved. Even so, Penukonda was not Hampi. It lacked the vast avenues, the monumental gateways, the sprawling marketplaces, and the deep cultural layers that had defined the old capital. Every comparison made the loss more tangible. Palace servants spoke in hushed tones. Visiting nobles walked the narrow corridors with a heaviness that reflected the rupture in the empire's identity. Yet amid the sorrow, practical tasks demanded attention. Tirumala understood that grief could not guide the next steps. Survival depended on action. He began by reorganizing what remained of the military. The shattered units that reached Penukonda were merged into new formations, combining veterans from different regions, so no one group carried the weight of responsibility alone. Commanders who had distinguished themselves during the retreat were promoted, giving the army leadership that had proved its resilience under extraordinary pressure. Recruitment resumed in districts still loyal to the empire. Blacksmiths repaired surviving weapons. Families of fallen soldiers received support, reinforcing the idea that the state still recognized its obligations. While these efforts unfolded, Tirumala sent envoys across the south to reassure leaders who feared that the empire had collapsed entirely. The letters carried a message of continuity. Vijayanagara still lived, and its ruler remained committed to protecting the realm. Some provinces responded with relief. Others hesitated, unsure whether the empire could defend them if the Deccan coalition advanced further. Yet most acknowledged Tirumala's authority. recognizing that rejecting him would leave their regions vulnerable to competing powers. Diplomacy became as essential as military recovery. Tirumala reached out to coastal commanders, temple authorities, and merchants who had long relied on imperial protection. He encouraged them to maintain trade networks, rebuild disrupted routes, and continue supporting local communities. This effort kept economic life from collapsing entirely. Though revenues had shrunk dramatically, the coin that did arrive sustained the basic functions of the state. Despite these early successes, the challenges facing Tirumala were immense. The Deccan sultanates, emboldened by their victory, occupied territories once held by Vijayanagara. Their advanced positions created pressure along the empire's northern boundary that could not be reversed quickly. Tirumala lacked the soldiers, resources, and political leverage to reclaim the lost lands. Every step had to be measured. Rash decisions would destroy what remained of the empire. Nevertheless, unrest simmered among some Nayakas who interpreted the fall of Hampi as evidence that the empire's divine mandate had ended. A few withheld tribute. Others strengthened their personal armies beyond what had been customary. The empire's unity, once forged through ambition and cultural cohesion, now depended on persuasion rather than unquestioned authority. Tirumala met these challenges with a balance of firmness and patience. When defiance risked destabilizing a region, he intervened quickly, dispatching trusted commanders to restore order. In less volatile cases, he allowed space for negotiation and compromise, understanding that rigid demands might push uncertain allies toward rebellion. Penukonda gradually transformed into a functioning capital. Meeting halls rang with discussions about land rights, frontier defense, and tax collection. Scribes rebuilt administrative ledgers. Temple festivals resumed, smaller than before, but sacred enough to preserve morale. Craftsmen who fled from the north set up workshops within the fortified walls, bringing with them the skills that had once filled Hampi's markets. Life did not return to what it had been, but it gathered enough rhythm to sustain the empire's identity. Tirumala's leadership rested heavily on his ability to hold these fragile threads together. His presence alone provided reassurance to displaced nobles and military leaders. The memory of his composure during the retreat, steady, unbroken, gave the court a sense of direction. Yet even as stability grew in Penukonda, Tirumala knew the empire could not remain in this position forever. A capital should inspire confidence, not reflect survival. The empire needed a place where administration could flourish, where trade routes converged, and where distance from the Deccan front allowed leaders to plan without fear of sudden attack. Chandragiri offered that possibility, surrounded by lush hills and situated along routes that linked the interior to the coast. It possessed natural advantages Penukonda lacked. When scouts returned with reports of its defensibility and potential for growth, Tirumala made the decision quietly but firmly. The imperial household would move again, not as refugees this time, but as a court seeking renewal. The journey to Chandragiri unfolded with less urgency than the flight from Hampi. Yet every step reminded those who travelled with him of how far the empire had fallen. Soldiers marched with disciplined silence. Nobles accompanied the procession with guarded curiosity, unsure whether this new capital would offer the symbolic weight needed to restore confidence. When the caravan reached the hilltop fortresses of Chandragiri, they found a landscape ripe for reconstruction. Strong walls embraced the inner citadel. Sloping paths provided natural defense. Streams flowed through valleys fertile enough to support expanding settlements. Tirumala's court settled into the fortifications, transforming the site into a functioning center of governance. Council chambers were established, guard posts expanded, storage houses filled with grain cultivated from southern districts. Even the atmosphere felt different, less constrained than Penukonda, more hopeful than the ruins left behind at Hampi. For the first time since the battle, the Empire began to breathe a little easier. But the challenges that haunted Vijayanagara did not vanish, simply because the court changed location. Pressure from the Deccan did not subside. Armies from the coalition did not withdraw. Internal tensions did not disappear. Regions further south questioned the Empire's ability to enforce consistent rule, while territories farther north feared becoming buffer zones between Vijayanagara and the sultanates. Tirumala faced these dilemmas daily. His council debated strategies that varied from cautious diplomacy to limited territorial recovery. Each path carried risks. Despite these obstacles, Tirumala's leadership achieved something the Empire desperately needed: time. He brought enough stability to allow the shattered state to reorganize, enough calm to prevent large-scale rebellion, and enough presence to ensure that Vijayanagara survived not as memory, but as a functioning power. The Empire no longer stretched confidently across the south as it had under Krishna-Devaraya, but it still commanded loyalty from many regions that recognized the value of unity in an age of rising rivals. As the seasons turned, the Empire's future took on a new shape. It would not return to its former brilliance. The effort required to reverse the loss of Hampi was greater than any one ruler could achieve. Instead, Vijayanagara adjusted, slimmer in territory, more cautious in diplomacy, and heavily reliant on the relationships forged by successive generations of Nayakas. Yet in Chandragiri, despite the weight of all that had been lost, something enduring remained. Tirumala's court offered a reminder that empire was not only stone and splendor, but the willingness to continue even when the world had changed beyond recognition. The Aravidu dynasty held the realm together, not through conquest or spectacle, but through resilience. And that resilience, fragile and determined, marked the beginning of Vijayanagara's final chapter, one shaped by survival in the shadow of catastrophe and the effort to remain whole in a world that no longer feared the empire as it once had. Chandragiri offered shelter, but shelter alone could not restore an empire whose foundations had shifted beyond recovery. As the Aravidu dynasty worked to preserve what remained, the reality across the wider south began to take shape. Power was no longer centered in one capital. It was dispersing, carried away by men who had once served under Vijayanagara banners, but now saw opportunity where the empire saw only responsibility. The Nayakas, commanders once tied to the imperial system through duty, reward, and tradition, had become regional rulers in everything but name. Their lands, armies, and fortified towns functioned like independent states. Loyalties that had once flowed upward toward the capital now branched outward, anchored to local ambitions that no longer aligned with imperial needs. Tirumala's successors attempted to reassert influence, but the political landscape had changed. The empire no longer held the authority that had once commanded obedience through momentum alone. In the deep south, this transformation became unmistakable. Madurai, once governed as an imperial province with strict military oversight, now followed the rule of a Nayaka family whose ambitions grew with each passing year. Their control over trade routes and temple networks gave them resources comparable to a kingdom. Thanjavur, with its fertile plains and ancient ritual centers, developed its own administrative rhythm, Jinji. Perched atop its formidable hill forts, operated with the confidence of a stronghold that owed little to any distant capital. These regions did not break away through rebellion. They drifted gradually, steadily, naturally. Vijayanagara no longer commanded the surplus needed to support distant garrisons, nor could it dispatch forces quickly enough to influence regional politics. As this gap widened, the Nayakas filled it, sometimes by necessity, sometimes by desire, always with an awareness that the empire's reach grew shorter each year. Yet even as these new states strengthened themselves, they continued to invoke the memory of Vijayanagara. They upheld rituals tied to the old dynasty, minted coins with familiar symbols, supported temple traditions rooted in imperial patronage, and presented themselves as guardians of a cultural order the empire had once unified. Their loyalty became symbolic rather than practical. They recognized the Aravidus as emperors in formal address, even as they governed their own domains independently. In this way, Vijayanagara lived on, not as an active power, but as a source of legitimacy that endured even when its authority no longer did. Back in Chandragiri, the imperial household struggled to adapt to this new reality. The territory under Aravidu control shrank to a cluster of districts that carried the weight of supporting a court designed for a far larger realm. Revenue dwindled. Military reserves thinned. The court could no longer afford grand campaigns or extensive architecture. Even the palace atmosphere changed. Officials once accustomed to managing an empire now spent their days negotiating tax disputes, reassuring uncertain nobles, or addressing the concerns of local leaders far more powerful than the throne could afford to alienate. Despite these limitations, the Aravidu rulers made earnest attempts to reassert influence. They restructured administrative posts, hoping to tighten control over their diminished territories. They hosted councils to ease tensions between regional elites. They sent envoys to coastal ports in hopes of maintaining trade partnerships that had sustained the empire for centuries. But each effort highlighted the imbalance between imperial aspiration and practical capacity. The world had grown larger while Vijayanagara had grown smaller. Where once its commands had reshaped borders and balanced the ambitions of great powers, its voice now reached only the regions closest to the capital. Conflicts among the Nayaka states further weakened the empire's position. Madurai and Thanjavur competed for influence over southern temple towns. Jinji strengthened its garrisons and expanded its alliances. As these rulers fought one another, the Aravidus attempted to mediate, knowing that unchecked conflict could tear the remaining fabric of unity. Yet their interventions rarely carried enough weight to alter outcomes. The empire that once forced sultanates into negotiation could no longer compel cooperation from its own former subordinates. The passage of time revealed an even quieter erosion, the diminishing of the imperial identity itself. Younger generations grew up knowing Vijayanagara only as a legacy rather than a living force. They heard stories of Krishnadevaraya's campaigns, of Hampi's golden avenues, of festivals that drew pilgrims from across the peninsula. But these stories belonged to a world that no longer existed. In Chandragiri, the court continued to perform the rituals of kingship, but the rituals began to feel like echoes, ceremonies repeating gestures of power without holding its substance. Yet despite all this, the dynasty endured. The last Aravidu rulers held the title of emperor with dignity, even if their dominion extended only across a diminishing territory. They maintained the traditions of their ancestors, supported temples, presided over festivals, and upheld the symbols that had once marked them as rulers of the South. Their perseverance offered a final thread of continuity in a world that had moved on. Still, the end approached gradually, not in a single dramatic moment. When pressures mounted, local disputes, shifting alliances, conflicts between Nayakas, advances from neighboring states, the empire lacked the resources to respond effectively. The court attempted diplomacy, but rival powers no longer feared the consequences of defiance. They pressed forward, reshaping borders around the shrinking Aravidu realm. By the time the dynasty's authority faded completely, the empire's identity had already transformed. What remained was not a centralized power, but a constellation of regional states shaped profoundly by the world Vijayanagara once built. The Nayakas ruled independently, yet their courts reflected the architecture, administration, and cultural patterns forged under the old empire. Temple traditions survived under their protection. Trade networks adapted rather than collapsed. Even political rituals maintained echoes of the imperial past. In this way, Vijayanagara did not vanish. It dispersed. Pieces of it lived on in Madurai's royal courts, in Thanjavur's temples, in Ginji's fortresses. In every region that had once formed its vast body, the empire died as a state, but survived as a legacy woven into the identity of South India. When the last Aravidu ruler held court, the ceremony felt more like remembrance than dominion. The banners that once signaled imperial reach now marked continuity. The throne symbolized the end of an era rather than the power of one. And as the dynasty faded, the world it shaped continued to move, strengthened by the memory of an empire that had risen from granite hills, shone across a continent, and endured long after its capital fell to ashes. Vijayanagara was gone, but its imprint remained, a shadow stretching far beyond the life of its final emperors.